Hola a todos, muchas gracias, Alfredo. Entonces voy a proceder a introducir esto. Good afternoon for those that just joined us, and welcome to our second conference of the first edition of the International Congress of Horror and Metal, Year Zero. This next conference is the first one of three that will be conducted in English. I am elated to introduce and moderate this conference by Dr. Dean Swinford, titled, as Alfredo said, The Forest, the Tower, the Ocean, Lovecraftian Motifs and Metal Identity in Death Metal Epic Novels. Dean Swinford is a novelist and professor of English at Fayetteville State University. He teaches in areas ranging from classical and medieval literature to contemporary dystopias, legal studies, and writing. His fiction includes The Inverted Cat of Aces, Goat Song Sacrifice, the first two books of the death metal epic, as well as work that has appeared in the Café Iriel, Dispumation, and The Healing Monsters. He's also the author of Through the Demon's Gate, a study of Johannes Kepler's Somnium, and its reliance on narrative motifs associated with medieval dream visions. His recent scholarly essays have appeared in journals and edited collections, including Medievalism and Metal Music Studies, Studies in Medievalism, Modern Philology, the Journal of Medieval Religious Cultures, Classical Traditions in Science Fiction, The Real Reader, and Kafka's Creatures. He's currently finishing work on the Sinister Synthesizer, the final book of the death metal epic. And before we start, allow me to remind the audience that if you have any questions and or comments, kindly send them in the chat box. This goes for our audience in the Zoom call and for those who are following us on Facebook as well. At the end of the conference, we will do our best to address this in a very brief Q&A section. So welcome, Professor. We want to thank you for being here. We're very happy to have you here. And without no further ado, please begin.
Okay, thank you, everybody. I'm going to share my screen here too. Thank you so much for the opportunity to talk to you today. I think I'm just going to do it like this. I think if I do this slideshow, I might have some weird thing occur and I'll disappear. So I'm just going to do it like this, if that's okay with everybody. Yeah, I am Dean Swinford, a professor of English at Fayetteville State University. My research area is medieval and early modern literature with a focus on the rhetoric of early modern science, particularly in Neoplatonist philosophy, narratives of dreams and cosmic ascent, and proto-science fiction texts, such as Johannes Kepler's Somnium, which include a mix of these subjects. At the same time, I've been writing in two different areas directly inspired by my lifelong love of heavy metal and all of its various forms. First, as a metal studies scholar, I've been researching poetic tropes and narrative techniques used in second wave black metal lyrics and liner notes that serve to evoke the Middle Ages in various ways. Second, as a novelist, I've written a trilogy, The Death Metal Epic, that tells the coming of age story of a guitarist in an underground metal band. My scholarly interest in science fiction, mysticism, and narrative tropes come together in my creative writing. My talk today is looking at the interplay of two opposing yet complementary narrative strands, one realistic, one fantastic in my fiction. So the three books of the death metal epic, you've got the Inverted Catabasis there in the middle. That's the first book. Goat Song Sacrifice is on the left for you. Sinister Synthesizer, as you can see, that is not looking like a book. That is looking like a folder with a sticker on it, because that's basically where it exists at this point. But anyway, the three books are set at some non-specified point in the early 90s. In terms of metal history, I'm trying to write about the point where death metal peaked, then dwindled. Black metal eclipsed it, at least in the public eye. And then both genres splintered into a profusion of hybrids, ambient side projects, and one-off experimental albums. Each book has fictional bands that are loosely modeled on real bands and albums. As someone deeply obsessed with metal when this happened, it was weird to me to see up-and-coming bands from my local Florida scene, groups like Resurrection or Brutality, that seem like the heirs to the legacy of Morbid Angel, Obituary, or Cynic, suddenly relegated to the dustbin of history and quickly dropped as labels drooled over North American re-releases of black metal classics by Emperor and Darkthrone and fought to sign bands like Ancient, who had amazing art direction, but in my opinion at the time, lackluster music. And then at the moment that so many black metal bands achieved fame and notoriety, they just as quickly released albums that seemed consciously designed to drive away listeners. And, a great example of that would be, so Beherit's Drawing Down the Moon, a classic of black metal. And then a year or so later, they released this dark ambient album, H418 of 21C, which really goes down a very different musical path and definitely threw off lots of listeners for sure. So as a fan, I wondered what happened to the musicians who didn't make it, or the ones who made it and then walked away after releasing an obscure concept album played entirely on a Casio, of course. And as a writer, I always thought that the interesting story would be about musicians who didn't achieve worldly success. Unlike most musician biopics that turn their subjects into demi-divinities, my books would explore a different path. I told myself as I started to write, that was basically how I wanted to approach the story. I wanted to write about the outcasts of a genre already regarded as outcast. I wanted to write about people who had a brief brush with fame and then moved on with their lives. I thought that was more realistic and more in keeping with the ethos of underground metal. What is fame but a false idol worshipped unceasingly by mainstream pop music? The more I worked on my books, I realized that I was also exploring a more personal question. Why do I like heavy metal? That and related questions like, why does anyone like metal? What are we getting out of it? Is it helping us or hindering us as we engage with the world? These questions suffuse my books through the choices and actions of the characters, the continual references to bands and albums, and the recurring images used to give shape to metal itself as a kind of character, as an allegorical representation of the genre. The books explore the way that the characters use metal music and its fantastic supernatural imagery as a way to escape from the drudgery of real life. My characters never achieve this escape, though, because the real world, jobs, relationships, family, exerts a stronger draw than any kind of nefarious spiritual force or Cthulian nether being grunted into existence by the most brutal of bands. In keeping with this conference's focus on horror and metal, this will be the opposition that I want to talk about. Moreover, I hope to focus on the parts of the series that personify the genre and its draw through tropes and motifs taken from horror, fantastic literature, and of course, metal itself. So my books are published by Addle Addle, an indie press for offbeat literary fiction. Addle Addle is a sister press of Grindhouse, which publishes extreme horror by writers like C.V. Hunt and Anderson Prunty. I often think of writing for this press as a little bit like being a band on an independent music label, or better, on the weird subsidiary of an already small and specialized indie music label. Anyway, that's the kind of story I tell myself to keep myself going. While my books are not explicitly horror and aim largely for a comic and generally lighthearted literary realism, they also feature an undercurrent of supernatural weirdness in keeping with my interest in metal's patterns of poetic imagery and vast storehouse of tropes, symbols, and images. So the inverted catabasis starts in Miami, Florida, where the protagonist David Fosberg has just learned that the rest of the bandmates of his Florida-style death metal band Valhalla have abandoned him. The band has released one album on Plutonic Records, but they have hardly gained fame or success from the endeavor. As one of his bandmates puts it, he made just about enough from the album so that he could buy a microwave oven. Still, David holds out hope to record one more album so that he can go on the European tour promised by the label to promote it. While the rest of his bandmates have gone on to college, he knows that he has nothing but a life of minimum wage labor to look forward to. This one opportunity to temporarily escape that eventuality motivates him in the first book and comes to haunt him in the remaining two books. Once he escapes from Miami, he feels the constant pull of failure that his inevitable return to that city signifies for him. David grew up in Miami, but he really hates it. David's journey away from Miami finds sonic expression in the bands that he works with through the series. So in the beginning of the book, he's the guitarist of Valhalla, a Florida death metal band. When I write about them, I'm always thinking of a band like Resurrection, whose involved existence had all the features of legendary Florida death metal releases. You've got the Stan Seagrave cover, you've got some Scott Burns production, but it's a record that never really went anywhere. Later on, when he joins forces with another character in the book, Juan, a self-styled mystic poet obsessed with the comparative mythography of writers such as Joseph Campbell and Robert Graves, he plays in a reformulated group now called katabasis, a word that in myth refers to a journey into the underworld. With Juan as his guide, David makes an album, In Circle of Ouroboros, that evokes the mix of doom and experimental ambient associated with bands such as Thurgathon, Disembowelment, or My Dying Bride. Once he's in Belgium, which happens at the end of the first book, David joins Desecration, a stripped down black metal act fronted by Jürgen Svart, a guy who, in his day job at a record shop, only stocks music by a few groups, including Celtic Frost, Bathory, and Sodom, plus, of course, a full arsenal of Desecration demo tapes and self-released 7-inches. When I'm writing about Desecration in its earliest iteration, I'm generally thinking of the very first Gorgoroth album, or even something like the first Art Noir album. Much of Goat Song Sacrifice, the second book, is about Svart putting Desecration together and the band recording their magnum opus, Inferno. Once Desecration are on Despondent Abyss, so this is kind of like the cult music label, they interact quite a bit with that label's main act, Astrum Psychos, a name taken from the reputed author of an ancient text on dream interpretation. If Desecration is all about reestablishing the gritty mastery of creator, destruction, and Sodom, Astrum Psychos has deeper cosmic and philosophical pretensions. Musically, I imagine Astrum Psychos' album, The Intrapsychic Secret, as something similar to The Nocturnal Silence, the first Necrophobic record, Ophthalmia's masterful Journey in Darkness, or even Catatonia's Dance of December Souls, paired with lyrics imbued with elitist, literary, and anti-cosmic philosophical tendencies. By the time we get to Sinister Synthesizer, members of Astrum Psychos have effectively hijacked Desecration and replaced all of its members in an effort to siphon off the royalties of Inferno, which somehow enjoys limited commercial success. In this final book, genres and bands fragment. Desecration, now consisting only of Nordicron, Necrocore, and a drum machine, release a proto-dungeon synth album punctuated with screams of torture. So imagine Abruptum crossed with Mortis. David Fosberg's story is a quest narrative that differs from the standard template of the rags to riches story so common in narratives about musicians and other artists. It is a quest whose hero remains continuously uncertain about the quest itself. It is a quest whose hero is not even sure he wants the thing that he searches for. At the same time that the books tell the story about a guy's slow and long-suffering descent further into the metal underground, and this despite the supposed successes he achieves, a European tour, new albums, a place on the roster of Despondent Abyss, that most obscure of all record labels. The books are just as much an attempt to explore metal's complex allure and the way that it shapes those who seek it and use it to order their lives. This second point, the way that the books are interested in metal's allure and the way that it shapes individual identity, is something I want to explore further. And this conference is an ideal place, I think, to do this. As a writer with a strong interest in allegory and personifications of supernatural creatures, when I'm writing the books, I also rely on a recurring pattern of Lovecraftian imagery that is so common in metal as a way of representing metal's thonic draw. Not just on David Fosberg, but several of the other key characters in the series who I've already referred to in passing. So for example, Juan, who guides David with his mythographic obsessions, Necrocore, guitarist of Astrum Psychos and head of the Despondent Abyss record label, and Nordicron, the singer of Astrum Psychos, who ends up leaving that band and joining Desecration. While the main storyline is told in a relatively straightforward first-person point of view set solidly in contemporary reality, the books also feature a series of characters that diverge from the storyline and interpose philosophical meditations on metal and a series of fantastic narratives that imagine encounters with three allegorized personifications of metal itself. In the books, these chapters are all referred to as meta-metal. They are meta-metal in that they refer back to metal and self-reflexively examine metal music, philosophy, and culture. Each book has 3 meta-metal chapters. 2 deal with some aspect of metal itself, and the third tells a story about one of metal's personified forms. In a nod to the exploration of metal through narrative, Each of these stories also shows some kind of encounter with that infamous tome that is so central to metal's treasure trove of poetic images, namely the Necronomicon, styled in my books as the source of metal, and as a recurring textual signifier of my books themselves as written expressions of metal music. The meta-metal chapters that treat features of metal itself vary widely in their approach. In the inverted catabasis, one deals with death metal intro tracks. One deals with death metal intro tracks, while another presents the fictional liner notes of In Circle of Ouroboros, an album that David and Juan, bandmate, annoyance, and spiritual guide, released as Catabasis, a dynamic duo of funereal doom. Goat Song Sacrifice begins with the meta-metal chapter called Cult of Necro that explores the idea of total death, advanced by Necrocore and Nordicron, two characters who, in this second book, flagellate David and his bandmates down more of a blackened path. The book also features a meta-metal chapter that explores band logos and connects the idea of the logo as an image of a band's name to logos, the philosophical and theological idea of the word as spirit. The meta-metal chapters that recount encounters with the Necronomicon have a fantastic and fabulistic quality to them. The first book has a dream of the Necronomicon, the second has the Necronomicon Eucharist, and the third, alluding in its tile to Niall's penchant for lyrics and songs that recall the language of ancient spellbooks, has chapter for inscribing the words of the Necronomicon on coelacanth scales. When writing these chapters, I'm aiming for the kind of style used by Italo Calvino in books like The Castle of Crossed Destinies and Invisible Cities. While they're told in first person, the identity of the narrator remains unclear. Their style differs from that used by David Fosberg in the rest of the story. David Fosberg curses, speaks in fragments, and punctuates his thoughts with dude and bro. The meta-metal narrators, by contrast, dispassionately describe their otherworldly quests through mythic realms largely untouched by modernity. These three chapters are also connected by a few rules that I set for myself when writing. I guess that's another Calvino influence there. The first rule is the most basic. Each story depicts an encounter with the Necronomicon. That's simple enough and just helps with plot. In one, the book is in a forest. In another, it is in a tower. And in the third, it exists in the ocean. The second rule helps to link the stories back to metal. Each is prefaced by a verse from a song that in some way connects to the musical themes and preoccupations of that book. The first one starts with the verse from Deicide's Dead by Dawn, the second with Bearer of Pain by Candlemas, and the third comes from Maleficent Dream Void by Liars in Wait, a more obscure band certainly, but better known as the creation of Necrolard, artist of iconic albums by bands such as Emperor and Dissection. The third rule is that each chapter ends with a religious or spiritual message that the narrator encounters within the Necronomicon itself. These are worship me, an imperative in keeping with the gods of all myth cycles. This is my body, Christ's explanation of the sacrament of communion to his disciples, and I am become death, words prefacing spiritual and bodily transformation in the Bhagavad Gita. There is considerable overlap between both types of meta-metal chapters. I see them as two intertwining strands, and the ideas and preoccupations of these meta-metal chapters influence the rest of the narrative in ways that become increasingly stronger as the books progress. The meta-metal chapters at the start of the books frame these concerns. Meta-metal, the intro, the first chapter in the inverted catabasis, is, on the face of it, an attempt to recreate in written language the sound and feel of a death metal intro track. I modeled it on one of my favorite intro tracks, the one from Bolt Thrower's Realm of Chaos. At the same time, it is an intro in the more conventional sense. It introduces the main characters of the three fantastic meta-metal narratives and identifies these as the various personages of heavy metal, styled as a classical muse on par with Calliope, referred to by Ovid as the chief muse, customarily aligned with epic poetry, and the mother of Orpheus, a musician famous for his own ill-fated catabasis. So here's the beginning of this first meta-metal section here. How do you start a death metal epic? In epic form, of course, you have to invoke the muse. Not Calliope, the beautiful voiced, but the very form of the voice of dread, a different muse. Its voice suggests its forms. Let's see, there we go. Its voice suggests its forms. Its voices suggest its forms. In one guise, gaunt, sepulchral, she is an ageless cadaver strapped in burning leather. In another, an octopoid, or is it serpentine, malevolence creeping along the ocean floor. At times, it takes the form of a living dead book fashioned from human flesh. All of these, none of these, a perverse trinity perverting the trinity. What kind of invocation does it demand? This chapter is concerned with classical myth. It's moved to immediately connect metal, a product of low culture, popular culture, something regularly scorned and belittled, to the muses, spirituality, and global epic, are those explored and explained elsewhere in the book through Juan, who constantly seeks to educate David on metal's essentially poetic nature. It also introduces the three embodied forms of metal in each chapter. An ageless cadaver strapped in burning leather, and you've got a Bathory allusion there. A shapeless malevolence creeping along the ocean floor. A living dead book fashioned from human flesh, and the intercombinations of their innumerable forms. All of these, none of these. The meta-metal chapter at the start of Goat Song Sacrifice further develops this alternate narrative about metal's allegorized embodiments. Called Cult of Necro, to show the book's transition away from death metal and to black metal. This chapter also emphasizes ideas like total death and the necro that are attributable to Necrocore and Nordicron. That shift in influence is in keeping with the main storyline as well. While David is guided heavily by Juan in the first book, Nordicron exerts a stronger influence in this book. So this is how this second book begins. Obscure signs mark the Necronomicon's pages, each brittle leaf a vast forest of forbidden knowledge, each letter obscure in its shape, its sound, its incarnadine hue. Once the true penitent has enacted the ritual necessary to locate the hidden book, floated through a living tunnel of twined branches connected at the roots to the book's source, and severed the book's sacred pages with sacred steel. Once the true penitent has done these things, the arduous task of severing its sacred meaning from its sacred signs remains. And beyond that, beyond the forest that in one telling holds and is the book, beyond the tower that in another conceals the crone who creates and destroys the book again and again as the book creates and destroys her, beyond the very ocean that in a third contains the host of beasts, the scaled armor of each engraved with a letter, the message of the book eternally configured and reconfigured as these beasts, these letters swarm in the depths. Beyond these and all other physical traces of the Necronomicon, one act remains, the act of invoking its hidden words and pronouncing in human speech a message that precedes and subsumes all that is human. The first sentence invokes the Necronomicon and likens its pages to the leaves of a forest. This is the version of the book encountered in the inverted catabasis. This first sentence also refers to the difficulty in deciphering whatever is written in the Necronomicon. And this is a theme that recurs in all of these meta-metal chapters. The second sentence offers brief descriptions of the main plot of each meta-metal chapter and begins by referring back to the main action of the meta-metal chapter in the first book. In this chapter, called A Dream of the Necronomicon, the character finds the book by floating through a living tunnel of twined branches and uses a knife to cut open its pages. In that story, the dark forest holds and is the book. In the meta-metal narrative that figures in Goat Song Sacrifice, there is a tower that imprisons a crone who creates and destroys the book again and again as the book creates and destroys her. The meta-metal narrative in Sinister Synthesizer, the last book, describes an oceanic descent past a swarm of ancient fish, coelacanths perhaps, whose bodies are each engraved with a single letter. The swimmer attempts to decode its constantly shifting, maddening, but ultimately decipherable message. The three passages seem like separate fantastic narratives that belong in the book, primarily through their creative visualization of metal lyrics, and yet their focus on the Necronomicon, the central object in each story, connects them back to the main narrative, connects them back to the comic tale of David Fosberg and his despondent loser peers. So I'll talk about the first one of these, Dream of the Necronomicon. The first of these narratives, A Dream of the Necronomicon, comes right after David Fosberg sorts through all the detritus of his time in his death metal band, Valhalla, and right before things begin in earnest with his partnership with Juan on the Catabasis project. In the chapter before this, he finds a death threat letter sent to him by Necrocore, who we learn later is the owner of Despondent Abyss, this record label that I mentioned. At this point in the book, though, Necrocore is just another hater. And this letter reminds David of all the other threats, mainly from religious fundamentalists and negative reviews, mainly from prog rock aficionados, that he's received in his time at the so-called vanguard of Florida death metal. In this death threat letter, Necrocore accuses David of making life metal, a phrase I borrowed, of course, from Euronymous, and curses him with the breath of centuries, a line I lifted from a Vader song that, like the deicide song that serves as the musical basis of the subsequent meta-metal chapter, also makes heavy use of Lovecraftian imagery. A Dream of the Necronomicon creates an abrupt break in the narrative, though it is thematically connected to the outer frame and serves as a symbolic bridge between the negative feelings of shame and worthlessness brought on by Necrocore's curse and the positive feelings of a new beginning that comes once Juan begins to initiate David into a metal more fully attuned to the rhythms and images of the monomyth that he sees as governing all artistic creation. The first line of this chapter aligns the speaker with the forest through which he walks. Like the darkened forest, I also wear a shroud, a black cloak. The wanderer comes to a fork in a path, and rather than heading to an inviting village, chooses the path that the forest itself impels him to take. Above, the branches, like the gnawed claws of a wizened shaman, point irresistibly down the left-hand path, and so I choose the left-hand path. As he goes deeper into the forest, he begins to float. He hears the sound of his own heartbeat, he thinks, resounding from within the trees. Something in the forest draws him with its power and takes him into the hollow center of some enormous tree, the walls etched with an endless cascade of wood rings marked over eons, each distinct impression its own saga of flood, flame, drought. And soon he discovers that he has been drawn to this alcove by the Necronomicon itself, and the sound he hears, what he thought was his heartbeat, is actually Deicide's Dead by Dawn, but slowed to 15 beats per minute and amplified by 100 bass cannons and rolling into the tree cavern like some monolithic beast seeking refuge. This intrusion of the song into the fantasy space of the speaker's encounter with the Necronomicon is the most obvious example of permeable movement between the two narrative strands. It also signals the possibility of additional areas of overlap. In order to read the book, the dreamer produces a knife from his robe, pricks his finger, and then squeezes a drop of blood onto the book. Its cover is barren and luminescent as the moon above. The book absorbs the blood, and the thundering rattle emanating from Glenn Benton's calloused vocal cords intensifies. The book demands to be cut. As the song goes, from the blood the words were said. Only in this way will it reveal its message. While this passage presents a living book, complete with an unblinking eye, the dreamer's action of feeding it blood does not belong exclusively to the realm of horror tropes and, in fact, presages plot developments in the main narrative. Later in the novel, David Fosberg meets Necrocore in a bar while he is on his ill-funded European tour. Necrocore reveals that because of David and Juan's genre-defying Catabasis album, he actually wants to sign their band to his label. David isn't sure whether to trust him. He remembers his death threat letter he'd received from this guy just a couple of months before. At the same time, he has no other options and is easily swayed by any show of enthusiasm for his music. Necrocore passes him a knife and wants David to sign, in blood of course, with Despondent Abyss. David, concerned about contracting hepatitis or something worse from Necrocore's germy blade, instead jabs himself with a toothpick and smears a drop of blood on a beer coaster. David signs in blood because he can't do otherwise. He sees his role as a metal musician as the only thing keeping him from failure. He doubts this path, but he sees no viable alternative. Even his signing in blood is an ironic signature on a beer napkin. In this way, the message that the floating mystic reads in the Necronomicon applies to David Fosberg's life choices in the real world. So, and then this is kind of back to the end of this Dream of the Necronomicon narrative. So he slices slowly, then drops the knife, which falls to the ground. Instantly, it sinks into the earth, drawn under by whatever creatures tunnel beneath the roots of the trees. I open the cover. The book's eyelid flutters beneath my palm. Words like wounds read "worship me" and letters formed from razor gashes. Terrified, I flip to another page and then another. The same bleak message, the same ornate script pronounces its doom, my doom. The terror that the protagonist experiences at the end, the terror that this message pronounces its doom, which is also his doom, also connects this narrative back to a central memory in David Fosberg's childhood that is recounted in an earlier chapter as a possible source of David's attachment to metal. In Where the Nameless One Sleeps, the chapter title, another nod to Lovecraft and the numerous metal songs that use that phrase, David recalls a childhood journey into a kind of forest, in this case, a South Florida mangrove swamp where the land meets the sea. This mangrove is wedged between David's suburban neighborhood and Biscayne Bay. David is in the swamp exploring and playing with plastic swords when he and his friends encounter a boar's head hanging from a tree. This encounter happens when David is a child in the early 1980s, and he connects it to other memories he has of his neighborhood. The sound of gunshots and helicopters coming from the swamp at night, a leaflet from the DEA telling people in his neighborhood to avoid the swamp. For this story, though, the boar's head is less a commentary on the drug war and more of an incursion of the chthonic kingdom of death into a young metalhead's life. The encounter with the boar's head is one of several childhood memories that haunts David, and that he sees as omens of whatever has drawn him down metal's left-hand path, a phrase that has special significance for David, who is himself left-handed. The knife that the mystic finds in his robe and uses to unseal the Necronomicon's pages parallels the plastic sword that David drops in shock as he flees his gruesome discovery. The boar's head hangs from the tree in a way that parallels the Necronomicon itself, which levitates in a hollow in the center of a tree. The buzzing of the flies from the boar's head parallels the insect buzzing that transforms into the syrup-slow sounds of deicide, an intrusion of the real into the realm of the pure fantastic that the mystic encounters in the sacred wood. So this is like the real world encounter of David. Something the size of a dog, a mastiff, or an overfed terrier hung from the trunk. A boar's head lashed to the tree with a buoy. The cicada song ebbed and we heard the flies, thousands of them, swarming around the boar's eyes, ears, and mouth. A pool of thick black blood coagulated on the ground. Flies spilled out of the jagged gash of a neck, as though the head was hollow, a fly hive of flesh. We didn't hear a voice. No one fell into an epileptic fit. We felt no urge to bludgeon one another with conchs. This is not a supernatural tale. We stood and stared. The flies buzzed around our heads too, looking to colonize our skulls, fill them with eggs. But even as David remembers this strange encounter, even as he sees it as one of several memories that drew him to metal, he also undercuts the possibility of the supernatural actually interposing itself into the realm of the real. In this passage, David mocks the way the scenario would likely play out in another genre. While the flies never actually colonize the skulls of David and his friends, the book connects their attraction to metal to events like this that suggest the possible existence of something other than suburban daily reality. And while David dismisses the supernatural, he remains influenced by those who are strongly influenced by spirituality. This section comes right before David begins working with Juan, who, even at their initial meeting, conveys a strong belief in the enduring power of the imaginary, at least as depicted, represented, and represented in art and literature. Okay, so this is the initial place where David meets Juan. At this point, David's working in a bookstore, and Juan is there getting a book that he wants for a tattoo. Are you into lore? The way he said it, I thought he meant a band. Lore. It sounded doomy, like Candlemas, something forlorn and direful. He didn't let me answer. You seem like you might be. Not many people are these days. Lore? You know, the imaginary, the stories and images that never really die, but keep repeating, even here in this ridiculous city. I scanned the shelf, found the book, and handed it to him. It wasn't hard to find. The spine was bright yellow with black writing, like a traffic sign. I've been looking for this book for a while. I thought I'd have to special order it. He started flipping through the pages. What's it for? He'd sparked my curiosity. The book was thick. It looked serious. Unlike most of the books people actually bought, it had no pictures except for a sketch of some weird symbols, 3 ladies, a snake, a pentagram on the cover. I'm doing a bit of reading for a tattoo I'm getting. It's going to be of the Ouroboros here around my heart. The Ouroboros? I had no clue. It sounded like the name of a sandwich. An Ouroboros Deluxe, extra pickles. You've never heard of it? No, what is it? A mythical creature. No, more importantly, it is the mythical creature, the creature at the center of every story, a creature that lies at the center of the underworld and the heart of the imperial sphere, a creature that does both simultaneously whilst roiling beneath the toiling waves of the ocean. I stepped back. Dude used the word whilst, another very un-Miamian move. It's the serpent that lives in the water, that marks the equator, not dead but dreaming, the tip of its tail in its fang-filled jaws. When it awakes, it will drown the city. For one, poetic myth and the monsters that inhabit its labyrinths of signs and images are desirable because of their direct opposition to daily reality and the unimaginative people happy to live there. David admires Juan's ideas, but by the end of the inverted catabasis, he himself never manages to put them into practice. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about the tower. So the first section was about the forest in the first book, and then we'll talk a little bit about the tower here. Like a dream of the Necronomicon, the meta-metal narrative in the second death metal epic book marks an abrupt departure in narrative style from the rest of the novel, while engaging with its themes in a different poetic register. While the first book deals primarily with the European tour that David chases as a way to escape from his minimum wage job, the second book chronicles the assembly of Desecration and the writing of their album Inferno. The speaker of the Necronomicon Eucharist is a pilgrim in some kind of religious procession. This narrative is prefaced with a stanza from Bearer of Pain by Candlemas. In a nod to the deicide influence of the previous meta-metal narrative, this begins as the narrator describes a position as one of many. Legion, we are legion, nameless, faceless. We share a single robe. Its many cowls rise like the snowy peaks of some forgotten mountain range. They process to a tower, and once there, free the priestess imprisoned inside. A year before, she had been a young girl. Now, the narrator notes, wrinkled and tottering, she is older than the oldest among us. Splotches of dried blood cake her desiccated skin. In the tower, the celebrants also find a book, the Necronomicon, resting on a lectern and displaying one line, "This is my body." They cut out the page, and each celebrant eats a scrap of the paper. The narrator grabs a page and pinches a piece, the letter I, the dot, a globby heart, and then places a scrap on his tongue and swallows. The medieval or medievalistic atmosphere, robed pilgrims moving through a hilly countryside over a stone bridge into a spiral staircase tower, connects to one of the central components of Goat Song Sacrifice, which is David's just getting used to living in the city of Ghent in Belgium. The city is known for its medieval architecture and monuments, including the Belfort Tower and St. Bob's Cathedral, both of which figure into the books. On a trip to the Belfort Tower, David meets Desecration's new singer, Nordicron, an enigmatic and to David repellent and unpleasant character whose belief in life as a brief stage that never escapes the all-encompassing power of total death affects his ability to interact with others in any kind of normal or sociable way. This trip to the Belfort Tower and the Museum of Medieval Torture Implements at the top happens after David has a bout of chicken curry-induced salmonella. His initial encounter with Nordicron happens when he still feels queasy and unsteady on his feet. For Nordicron, though, David's week-long sickness has brought him close to the realm of death and disease that Nordicron himself savors. So they go to David's apartment, and it smells terrible in there, and all of his other friends are remarking on how terrible it sounds, but not Nordicron. Nordicron comes closer to David, gets as close as he can, and he says, he sees the dried snot on David's face, and he says, "The dried snot on your face, you have the aura, the aroma, even the visage of a plague victim." So this also gets into some of the themes here of the things that Nordicron is about, really differs from the kind of instruction that Juan gives in the first book. The Necronomicon Eucharist in this initial encounter with Nordicron appears at the center of the novel. The Necronomicon Eucharist falls at the end of the first part of the novel, and Nordicron is introduced at the beginning of the second part. There's a lot of parallels between the two narratives in the same way that I was talking about in the first book with the representation of the forest. So in the same way that in this meta-metal chapter that these pilgrims are going into this tower, and then there is this crone who is producing the Necronomicon at the top of the tower. David climbs Belfort Tower in Belgium, and as he climbs to the top of the tower, he actually should be feeling great. Like he has found a new band. It has all of these people who seem really serious about their music. And yet, even as he does that, he has this sinking realization that he's not going to be able to fit in here, and that the ideas that they're wanting to him to represent are not ones that he feels comfortable with. So that he realizes, for example, he finds Nordicron repugnant, but he also realizes that he's put himself in a position where he's going to be subservient to Nordicron's artistic vision. Okay, so here I'm going to wrap it up. While the death metal epic is primarily a coming-of-age story told with humor, it also uses a thread of fantastic narratives to evoke atmospheres and scenarios encountered in metal lyrics themselves. These narratives are themselves united in their altering depictions of the Necronomicon, and the components of each present metal itself as a kind of allegorical personification. While these narratives may seem disconnected from the main plot, they also include details that reflect and expand on David's attempt to make music and to understand his own unshakable fascination with metal. At the same time, the way that the books present competing and overlapping representations of metal, a sentient book that controls the forest, a prisoner trapped in a tower, a swarming mass of prehistoric fish, these all serve to open up additional images of metal's being. Rather than limiting metal to those shapes conjured within the death metal epic, these meta-metal narratives invite readers to conjure their own visions of metal's vast array of potential forms. All right, thank you again, everybody. I want to especially thank everyone involved in organizing this conference. This is a great opportunity, and I think that this is an amazing meeting of subjects, bringing together metal and horror. This is definitely an area that is a new area that definitely has much to offer. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Dean Swinford, for this presentation, and I will address the questions placed by the audience, if that's okay with you.
Yes.
So first, there's a comment by Amanda, who is also presenting in this Congress for you, so you know.
Oh, yes.
Yeah. He says, Lovecraft has a problem with race, and he often dismisses women or even discriminates against them, and metal does too. I think this is something that we don't talk about enough. Like, what's your take on this?
I mean, sure, I agree with her on that. Yeah, you know, that makes sense for sure. Yeah, I don't think that that's really, you know, something that I'm engaging with, but definitely that's a good point. And I think that actually in her talk, she deals with some of these subjects in another novel that uses black metal for sure.
So that's good. Let's wait for her talk then, so you can expand more on this. Thank you for your comment. There is another comment from someone here in the chat. Salud, I lost your name, I'm sorry. He says, trying to explain the Ouroboros to people who don't have a clue about it, you can sometimes get unexpected reactions and results. Has this happened to you before?
Well, I guess a lot of the humor of the book, and I guess for, you know, if we're as metal fans, right, like for us, even the things that we're talking about, or for example, in the last panel, you know, this whole realm of images and artists and everything like that. I think for all of us as metal fans, there are things that that we don't need to have explained so much, right? So it seems like in terms of poetics, you know, we're, as metal fans, there's this whole range of art and literature and ideas that don't necessarily need explanation, yet at the same time we're also living in you know, having relationships with people and dealing with parts of our lives where where all of those things are not evident, are not self-evident. But, and I think that's, you know, kind of what I was saying is about having these different narrative strands, or for example, that the character, that's one of the things that he's, you know, and a lot of the characters are trying to work through in the book is like, you know, what is metal doing for them, right? Like, how is it signifying for them? It's obviously something that is connected to, that has all of this power and multiple levels of signification. At the same time, there are all these places where, you know, it seems at odds with, you know, what they might see as moving forward in their life in some way.
Okay, thank you for that. Gabriela Gomez, a member of our seminar, also presenting later, so stick around. She asked, I wonder if there's another way to understand the system of metal, yeah, would be to identify each character or scenery as an archetypical figure.
Yeah, I mean, you know, you could do something like that with every character, and actually, you know, I'm working on the third book, and in the third, I really didn't talk too much about the third meta metal chapter, just because of time, and also like I'm still kind of working on the manuscript. But what's interesting is that I'm trying to, like in the third book, I'm showing ways that all of these different characters, even though they're separate characters, that there are places where it's almost like they're all kind of sharing the imagination of these narratives. So without, I guess, giving away too much, but one of the characters, well, he he dies basically, or he, you know, you think he dies basically, and then and he's kind of like ingested, you know, if you read stuff about zombies, like the spine fish that people use to create like this kind of catatonic state. Anyway, getting back to coelacanths and weird fish. Anyway, in the last meta metal narrative, there's this indication that that it's another character, this is the vision of another character, you know, so there's a little bit of that interplay between the characters and the main narrative, and then what's going on in these fantastic narratives, and then it kind of shows that those levels are a little bit more permeable. And then another thing in that book, the character Nordicron, who I've talked about, this singer, so he's always carrying around his lyric sheets, right? And in the last book, David finds the lyric sheets and actually sees, like, he's going to see that some of the passages that like even ones that I've talked about in these meta metal narratives are in his lyric sheet. So it's almost as if he's like an author in some way of these texts that have been presented as like dream and imaginary texts otherwhere.
Thank you very much. We have a question from Alfredo, and he asks, is there a Mexican novel about metal suggesting a listening playlist? Would this, I'm sorry, let me rephrase. There's a Mexican novel about metal that suggests a playlist. Would this work with a death metal epic? Like, would you base the playlist related to your book?
Oh yeah, like make a playlist for the book. Yeah, I mean, you could, right? I would think. You know, I think like with the, even just including, it's tricky, you know, I think because of copyright and stuff like that, right? Making connections to real things, and then at the same time trying to, I guess what I'm trying to do is create something where it's really borrows from metal history but is distinct from it. So like, for example, like I'm writing about black metal, and there obviously are some parallels to actual bands and characters, but I'm not trying to like retell the same story of black metal that's been told a million times, you know. Or like with the focus on Florida at the beginning. Well, like really for Florida death metal, most of the stuff is actually Tampa, but I'm centering it in Miami, like a much more minor scene. So I'm trying to I don't like this idea of like a monolithic, like this is the story, you know what I mean? And so in the book, I'm trying to work with imaginary bands, but so that it borrows from real things in ways that are convincing, but also altering the story here. Like my black metal bands are in Belgium, right? As opposed to Scandinavia, for example.
Yeah, that's very interesting how you can separate from Scandinavia, because everything that you read is sometimes inclined towards that, right?
Yeah, exactly. But then, there's so many other, if you look at the Greek scene, like Verathron and other bands like that who are putting out albums in the early 90s, or even I talked about Beharit earlier on, like Drawing Down the Moon, that are also really important for the development of that genre, but generally don't really get talked about because they don't sound like what it's supposed to sound like.
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned Greece right now, because there's a comment here in the chat too, and it says that without a doubt the best Lovecraftian bands and projects come from Greece. So it's really funny you just addressed that.
Yeah, because in the last talk somebody referred to Septic Flesh, right, about Geiger, and then and there's that connection to all the bands that come out of the Greek scene that they do there are a lot of interesting ones for sure.
Okay, the next question is by Iris Mojica, who is also here and also presenting on Saturday. So our question is, what about those characters who do not fit in the archetypical literature? How can you identify them and talk about them?
I'm not sure I understand. What do you mean?
Like, if you have characters that are not always inspired on these symbolisms, like how would you talk about a simple character, or do they always fit into the category of an archetype or a symbol?
Oh, that's a good point. Yeah, you mean like characters who are not into metal?
Yeah, or related to another topic towards Lovecraft, for example, or that they represent something beyond what they
Oh,
are.
sure. I mean, and in the third book, so like in the third book, for example, and another thing I didn't really talk about it, but so like David Fosberg also has this relationship. He's like flying this flame for this girlfriend who dumped him, and then they get back together, and then she comes to visit him, and they don't get along, but then he stops listening to metal because he thinks that like all of his problems are coming from this obsession with metal, and he's such a loser and he needs to do something else. And the fact that she broke up with him a second time is just so illustrative of that. And that's, part of it too, or like he has interactions with his parents who make fun of him for listening to metal, or his sister calls him a loser, all of these kinds of things. So the books really play with that. Like in this talk, I wanted to focus on these meta metal parts, but they're pretty short. I mean, basically, like each of these chapters is maybe I don't know, 10 pages each or less. And then each, the books total, it's each book's 200 pages in that area. So these are really small parts of it. But for this talk, I just wanted to talk about how they connect to all the stuff. But most of the rest is, and I'm sure that, all of us as metal fans are used to that, right? You're into all this stuff, you find the new album comes out, you're super interested in it, but then maybe you have no one to talk about it with, or no one who thinks it's interesting, right? I think that's kind of a common feature of life. If it's not, hey, good luck, that's great. But for me, that's for sure.
Thank you. Now, there's a question from metal music studies is relatively new, and then sometimes it's seen with suspicion by the academia. I want to know if you had obstacles, or what did you have to encounter when you were trying to have your vision in your book, right? When you were trying to make your project happen. I would like to know what you went through in a nutshell.
Yeah, that's a very good point. And I guess and I mentioned that at the beginning that, I've published much more traditional scholarship just in kind of like medieval, early modern studies, rhetoric of early science. But even that, I mean, my book on Kepler is called Through the Damon's Gate. And when I came up with the title, I was like, yes, it's so metal. Uh, and reading about Kepler and all this weird stuff, it's like in the Somnium, they summon a demon from the moon and all of this sort of stuff. I'm like, oh, there are these timeless connections that basically it sounds like it would be a great metal concept album. Yeah, I think that is true. On the other hand, I think that everything with metal music studies, like the International Society for Metal Music Studies and their journal and everything like that is very useful in kind of helping to make it more of a kind of like a topic of study that that would have a broader appeal. But I think that's true. I mean, I've gone to give metal talks at conferences and then, run into someone and they're like, what, you're giving a talk on what? Like thinking that that's a strange thing. And I don't understand it because to me, all of these connections of metal to literature and art, they're so crystal clear. So I think it's that idea of having to explain something that seems obvious.
Right, like, and now that you mentioned this, like speaking about the appeal, like we have time for a last question, and you use a lot of symbolism, of course, and a lot of context, as someone already mentioned. You need a lot of context, but this context is already in you if you're already interested in this, right? Like, did you find any difficulties trying to make this? Because your book sounds super entertaining. Like, did you find any difficulties trying to make like a good story, but at the same time putting all this symbolism and all this weight that you wanted to people to address in when they read your novel?
Yeah, I think that's a good point. It's I try to write in a way that somebody who doesn't like metal or doesn't know about metal is going to be able to follow it and get the story as a fundamentally human story, just about somebody trying to figure out who they are in the world. And then at the same time, I'll try to slip stuff in there that I would think, okay, someone who really likes metal is going to know this, like for example, in the talk today, I read from the very beginning of it, and then I used the phrase burning leather, right? And I'm like, everybody knows that's a Bathory song, right? They're gonna get it. But then I know that probably lots of people aren't going to get that. Or like if I have the character use a phrase like, the breath of centuries, I'm like, oh yeah, Vader, yes, that's, everybody's gonna get that title right there. But so I try to write it in a way that things are going to work and make sense if you don't get the references. But at the same time, I'll try to slip stuff in there. And really, it's like, well, whatever I'm listening to when I'm writing, I'll be like, oh, that would be cool to put that in there, but like in a totally different context, like to make it, to use it as part of a joke or something like that.
Okay, so it appears we're out of time, sadly, but we want to thank you for this talk. It was very interesting, and thank you everyone who was listening. And I'm going to switch to Spanish now. Los invitamos a seguir aquí en la siguiente conferencia, que es a las 6 de la tarde, me parece, de Chito Minor, La masacre de Claypole, horror, sangre y locura en la obra de Matan S.A. Entonces, para que nos sigan sintonizando. Thank you again, Professor
Okay.
Dean Swinford.
Thank you.
Y nos vemos todos más tarde. Gracias por estar aquí acompañándonos.